Boston doubles down on delaying gun carry permits, plus The Atlantic's Andrew Exum in defense of hunting. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. We get one email every Friday, and I think we do a pretty good job of letting you know what's going on. But this week, we have a special guest from The Atlantic, contributing editor Andrew Exum, who is joining us to talk about his interesting new piece on hunting. Welcome to the show, Andrew. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, man.
Can you just give people a little more background about yourself who might not know you?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in East Tennessee, went to school on an Army ROTC scholarship, served in the Army for a couple years, was in a regular unit in Afghanistan, kind of at the beginning of that conflict, and then led a platoon of Army Rangers in both Iraq and Afghanistan. After invading a couple countries and not knowing anything about the language, culture, people of the places I'd invaded, I decided I should probably go learn something. So did grad school out in the Middle East. Lived most of my late 20s, early 30s in the Middle East, learning Arabic and doing a PhD. Went back to work for the U.S. Department of Defense in a non-political job, and then went into business. I got dragged back into public service during the Obama administration to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy. Obviously, I did a great job in that role because it's a calm and tranquil region today. But over the past 6.5 years, I've just been back in business. My wife is a scientist. We've got 4 kids, and we live in the District of Columbia.
Yeah, and you also are an avid hunter, it sounds like.
I am, yeah. I am. I had always grown up around firearms, and kind of did sports shooting from a young age. But I didn't really start hunting until I was out of the Army and was married. And my wife was like, "Why do we have these firearms? And why do you have, why are you allegedly good at shooting things if you're not going to actually, fill the freezer every winter?" So, so I started hunting a couple years ago when we were living in Texas, and just going to really love it. I try to shoot a couple deer every year because that tends to be what feed the family. But I really enjoy upland hunting as well. We've got an American Brittany, so during the falls you can usually find me chasing grouse or woodcock somewhere. Really enjoy that, and that's something I enjoy with the kids as well. They tend to either come along with me and walk behind me on the dogs, or at the very least, my 4-year-old daughter loves to help me pluck the birds when I come home.
Nice. And so I get, presumably this passion of yours, this I guess newly found passion, is what led you to write this piece for The Atlantic in defense of hunting. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what you're getting at in that piece?
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I, we have we're odd, I guess, in one sense. And the reason why hunting matters to us is for the same reason that we're not like super conservative folks, far from it. But we really believe in kind of living sustainably, and the same reason why we feel we need to be connected to our food chain. We try to garden a lot. We forage a ton. We've got some land in Western Maine where we do a lot of foraging, and hunting and fishing are part of that, right? So I think if we're going to be eating meat, we don't want to do it in a sustainable way. If we can take some deer off people's property and butcher the deer ourselves, and prepare the meat ourselves, and and have our children be a part of that, I just think it's an important thing. So that's kind of what we do, and as part of trying to explain that to an audience at The Atlantic, which probably skews towards the left. Although, sure. I was shocked by the number of kind of positive emails and responses that I got from folks who I wouldn't traditionally associate with being, Atlantic readers, but who'd read it. I usually write on Middle East politics for The Atlantic, and this was something very, very different.
I think I believe Katie Pavlik from Fox had mentioned the piece as well, and
right.
And Gabby Hoffman, who's another a hunting advocate that I know well, and I've been on her podcast before. I've seen a number of people in the sort of hunting space discuss your piece. in a positive way. And you know, I thought it was a really good piece as well.
Oh, thanks, man.
Because it lays out sort of the positive case for why hunting is important, right?
Yeah.
That sort of seemed to be your goal here, trying to explain this to people who aren't hunters, who might be gun skeptical, why you partake in this activity, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, you know, there's room if you are a hunter, if you are somebody who cares about and preserving those opportunities to hunt for like the next generation. And like I said, this is something I do with my oldest son. We call him the great indoorsman. He's not like so into, you know, being outdoors with dad, you know, hunting. But my second son like loves to go out with me. My daughter can't wait to my oldest daughter can't wait to like, you know, go out with me. If you're somebody who is interested in preserving those opportunities for the next generation and for whom this matters, then I think like actually you don't necessarily line up with either kind of political party. Although I think, you know, the skeptics that I was really aiming at were folks kind of, you know, more left of center. I mean, you know, if you look at all the great, you know, conservation work that's been done over the past two presidents, and both President Biden through the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as President Trump through the Great American Outdoors Act, like they both have a lot to be proud of in terms of conservation, in terms of expanding hunting opportunities. I mean, both presidents have a lot to be proud of, but both of those, and you know, this is interesting, kind of historically. When there are times of like real partisan divide within Washington, D.C., conservation has historically been one of those things that Democrats and Republicans can sit around the table and kind of agree on. But it is true that, you know, a lot of the anti-conservation voices in the Senate, you know, all 25 votes against the Great American Outdoors Act, which President Trump signed, those all came from the Republican side. You know, we've seen erosions of protections of wetlands under, you know, under the Supreme Court and the conservative judiciary. So there are reasons to be kind of frustrated if you care about conservation with, you know, with more conservative Americans and with the Republican Party. By contrast, I get the sense that Democrats are so scared of offending, you know, very passionate folks within the party who are deeply ambivalent or hostile towards firearms that they can't talk about the role that hunting plays towards those same conservation goals that we have. I mean, the North American model of conservation is really remarkable. And it's, you know, it's one of the few like big government, scientifically driven programs that we've got that has like buy-in from some of our most conservative, like right-wing Americans buy into this North American model. But the skeptics that you often have to talk to about are you know, folks on the left. And I get the sense that like, you know, the Biden administration gets it. The folks, you know, Tracy Stone Manning, who runs, you know, Bureau of Land Management, she gets it. You know, that's not the issue. But I just get the sense that a lot of Democrats are hesitant to talk about it and to talk because hunting has become so deeply ingrained with association with firearms, frankly. And one of the things that, you know, there's been some polling that's come out over the past year, and we've started to see public support for hunting at kind of the lowest levels over the past 2 decades. And a lot of that has to do, it seems, with just kind of general ambivalence towards any types of firearms. So it's not just kind of hunting that's unpopular or that's becoming more unpopular. It's also, you know, even things like, you know, skeet shooting or, you know, shooting sporting clays or, you know, sports shooting. More Americans have grown, you know, ambivalent about even that. And so I think that we need to make a positive case for hunting and how it fits into our conservation goals as a country, so that people can kind of disaggregate that with whatever their, you know, personal feelings about firearms might be.
Right. And so can you just explain for us a little bit about how the system actually works right now, how hunting does, you know, beyond the physical act of, you know, taking a deer and keeping down herd sizes, things like that. How else does hunting in America contribute to conservation efforts?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, if you're listening to this and you are a gun owner or you regularly shoot, thank you. So, you know, there's a percentage of the sales tax off of, you know, guns you buy, ammunition that you buy, whether or not you're a hunter or not, that go towards, through the Pittman Robertson funding, that go towards conservation, that get fed into, you know, wildlife and game agencies. it is one of the, interesting things about kind of the way it's set up is that you do have kind of at the federal level, you've got certain, certain restrictions and certain, rules that govern. I mean, migratory birds, for example, there are certain rules that exist at more of the federal level. The fact that you can't shoot, lead at waterfowl, that's a federal rule that I think has been in place since 1991 under the first Bush administration. But mostly, we manage game in a pretty decentralized way, and in the United States. So when you get a hunting license, you get it at the state level. Also at the state level, you've got kind of biologists and fish and wildlife agencies that spend a lot of time managing and kind of monitoring the game population, in the United States, figuring out kind of how long does the deer season need to be. If you're going to shoot grouse, how many can you shoot on a daily basis to where we were able to maintain kind of a healthy population? What do we need to do in terms of working with landowners for habitat? So my wife and I are blessed to own a plot of land in Western Maine. I'll be up there in a few weeks, working with a biologist from the state of Maine, kind of looking at the land and seeing if some of the work that we've been doing to increase the habitat for grouse is paying off, for ruffed grouse is paying off. So that's all taking place at the state level. And again, if you go get a hunting license, you don't get a federal license, you get a state license, and that's kind of the way it works. And you buy into this pretty decentralized but very heavily regulated, activity, which is, again, one of just the things that's somewhat ironic. My neighbors in my extremely left-wing neighborhood of Washington, D.C. have kind of those signs that say, in this house we believe, and it says, 9 or 10 things. And one of them is always, science is real. And yet often the people that react, against hunting are the same people that have those signs in their yard. Right. And I try to say that, look, hunting is like the most scientifically, rigorously studied activity, government regulated. Like, all these things should tick a lot of boxes for left-leaning Americans like myself. And yet I think there's just deep ambivalence, probably because of firearms, and also I think the association that a lot of Americans have, and at least in their own minds, with hunting being something that, that's something that super conservative people do, and that's just not the case.
Right, and it does. I do think that there's a lot to get at with the bipartisan nature of hunting, approval for hunting. We've actually seen just recently there's been an issue with. Actually, just published a piece today on this. With funding for hunting safety programs in schools. Yep. Yeah, you might have read about this, where the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was passed last year changed the language of federal law to prohibit funds going to, the way the language reads, anyone who's being trained either to buy dangerous weapons or being trained in the use of dangerous weapons. Now, the Department of Education under President Biden has interpreted this to mean that the previously funded hunter safety programs and archery safety programs that schools have done across the country can't receive funding anymore. And now you've had a bipartisan group of senators, actually, I believe it's 9 Republicans, 12 Democrats, and then Kirsten Sinema, who's an independent that caucuses with Democrats. And they all sent 2 separate letters on this issue, hoping to get the department to either change its interpretation of the law that they passed, or get appropriations to add language to the next funding bill here that would clear things up, I guess. And that's one area where you have seen a significant bipartisan effort beyond, outside of the bill last year. It's really the only other time you've seen this, because you had things like the pistol brace ban that the Biden administration has tried to put into place that got some action in the legislature, but it was basically all Republicans on board with that. You didn't get any crossover support from any Democrats in the Senate, actually. And now you're seeing this materialize where there's a significant number of Democrats, even Chris Murphy, who, Chris Murphy and John Cornyn had were the two senators who basically came up with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and they're both on these letters, and so it's interesting. I wonder how that's going to play out, but it does, I think, speak to this bipartisan nature that you're talking about.
Yeah, and my sense is that, I follow that issue a little bit. My sense is that, the legislation was passed, and then, it goes to the executive branch. And essentially, there's some confusion about well, wait, what does this mean? Can we spend this on hunter safety? And whatever bureaucrat was just I don't think we can, not the way that it's written. And so, this came down, and I think it's going to I think it'll get taken care of. I'm pretty sanguine about this. It reminds me of, I think there was some earlier legislation last year that the state of California passed that was very much on kind of getting, gun training outside no gun training in schools, something like that. And
that was on advertising to youth shooters.
And it shut down school skeet teams or whatever. But it
shut down basically all youth competitive shooting in the state for a while.
That's right. But they eventually figured it out. And I do think that their common sense tends to reign eventually. But I mean, the challenge with any type of legislation is that then you have to interpret that legislation and figure out what it means. I would actually love to see the Congress and state legislatures, lean farther forward on this. And actually, I mean, we can talk about this later, but if we have had this kind of profusion of this explosion of small arms ownership, within the United States, and if we're going to grow up in if my kids are going to grow up in kind of this post-Heller world in which we're just going to have a lot more firearms, then I would love to see more firearms instruction in school and not less. Certainly firearms safety and hunter safety in general. I just see it as an unambiguous good. Yeah,
and I think we should talk a little bit about that, because you had another piece on firearms politics more last year after the Uvalde shooting, where you expressed more of your, overarching view of gun politics in the United States and gun culture. And, you're broadly negative towards the idea of ownership of things like AR-15s or firearms of that nature compared to, hunting rifles or shotguns. And so I did want to get your take on that, just a better explanation or a thorough explanation of where you're coming from.
Yeah, look, I mean, and this is something that your own, some of your viewers or listeners might think I'm, on a different planet when I say this, but I actually think most kind of gun rights issues in America have largely been settled in a post-Heller world. I think we are in a, the Supreme Court made a determination that we have individual right to gun ownership, which previously was much more ambiguous. Now it's not, and it's the reason why I, as a resident of Washington D.C., the District of Columbia, can own firearms and can register them with the police department and can keep them in my house. That's a change.
Handguns,
yeah, that's a change from from before. I think that we're not gonna have a legislative fix to, in an ideal world, I would prefer it if we did not have all these AR-15s around our country. That'd be my preference. I understand why people own them. They are fun to shoot. I've shot hundreds of thousands of rounds out of very similar weapons, throughout my career, especially in the in the Army.
Why do you see such a difference between them and a hunting rifle, a Remington 700 or something like that?
Yeah, the ability to kill lots of people very fast.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is.
So it's the semi-automatic nature of it. Is that what you're?
I think it's the semi-automatic, and it's also a reasonably large caliber. We're not talking about a Remington 1022, right? Which plenty of people own for squirrel hunting. It's a great 22 caliber rifle. But when you're talking about a 223 or a 7.62 round, and the ability to fire and reload them very quickly. I mean, look, I carried one in 3 combat tours. They are excellent weapons, but weapons. I understand.
Sure, but they're also on the lower end of the rifle caliber list, right? I mean,
there's a reason why they are, right? The reason why the U.S. Army switched to the 223 is the same reason that I shoot a 6.5 PRC at deer instead of a 300 Win Mag. It's easy to shoot. And if you're, I'm a large guy. I'm over 200 pounds, 6'2". So recoil, I'm not like hugely recoil sensitive, but it is just a fact that, lower caliber cartridges with just less of recoil are just going to be easier for people to shoot. And that's the reason why kind of the U.S. Army had adopted that after shooting, 30-06s for the better part of a century. They are just fearsome in terms of your ability to kill lots of people quickly. That's just the reality. Again, I'm not out here saying that they should all be illegal or we should, confiscate your weapons. I think that is a fantasy that, my more liberal friends might have. I think what we've got to fix first is, frankly, our gun culture. Stephen, I mean, I am somebody who owns a fair amount of guns. And one of the things I try to do is I probably shoot every other week. I'll go, shoot sporting clays, and I'll come back and I make a point of kind of cleaning my weapon or, cleaning my shotguns in front of my kids and showing them how to do it and try to introduce them to firearms in kind of a healthy way and see like, look, this is something that dad uses to shoot sporting clays. This is something that dad hunts with. You can see when dad comes home, with doves or with grouse or with the deer, how he's used these firearms. And my wife, who grew up in the New York suburbs, she thinks I'm crazy. She's like, you're trying to recapture some like gun culture that just doesn't exist anymore. Like that's not the gun culture that our kids are growing up in. And again, Stephen, I mean, I live in the District of Columbia. I think 11 people were shot this past weekend and several killed.
Yeah.
That's the gun culture that my kids are growing up around. They're growing up in a gun culture of school shootings, of doing active shooter drills in their elementary schools. I never had to do that. Now, granted, when I'm an old guy, so we were doing kind of nuclear war drills in my elementary school growing up. Worried about the Russians more than kind of an individual shooter. But I do think that there's something that's ill in gun culture in America. And I would like us to have a healthier relationship with firearms. I think there's lots of good stuff going on. Like, I think the current craze or popularity of long range shooting, I think that's really cool. I think that's great. But I also have some sympathy that many in your audience probably don't agree with. When President Obama talked about people clinging to their guns and their religion, I, as somebody who's like a believer in Jesus Christ and who goes to church every Sunday, and also as somebody who has guns, I knew exactly what he's talking about, because I think for a lot of people, both religion and their guns have become kind of totems or like symbols of belonging in the society, and are kind of divorced from any type of either actual faith or in the case of guns, using them for sport or for for some sort of real recreation. It's like people identify with their weapons in a way that's weird to me, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are going to disagree with that point of view, obviously.
Sure.
And a lot of people find that very condescending. That's why that's why that comment endured so long, right? Not to say that there's no issues with sections of gun culture where people are sometimes overly violent in their rhetoric, right? I don't want to sit here and try and say that there's no issues that exist with some gun owners in America. I think it's obviously not the case, nor is it the case that the AR-15 is some completely harmless firearm. I mean, there's no such thing, right, as a harmless firearm. Yeah. I guess, a lot of people would just, oftentimes when you hear these arguments, you start to wonder, where would you draw the line? I mean, there's far more powerful calibers. There's semi-automatic action has been around since the 1890s. Rifles are not, while they are involved in a number of very high profile shootings, like you discussed there, with mass shootings, they're not the most common firearm to be used in murders, especially not the kind that you were describing in DC, right? Those are we've got a proliferation of ghost guns in DC. When you look at kind of firearm violations in Washington DC, I mean, look, the only thing I would say is that I grew up around guns.
And I grew up in a different type of gun culture where I do not recommend this. All my guns are securely stored. I'm sure that's the case for all of your listeners as well. But like, we all grew up in an era where, you know, dad had like rifles propped up either in the closet or like behind a door. I mean, that was like the standard. That was not something that was seen out of the norm. But that was just, it was just a different, it was just a different culture around guns. And I noticed, I'll notice something that when I came back from, bear in mind that between 9/11 and roughly 2008, I didn't spend much time in America. So I was either at war or I was, otherwise abroad. And when I returned, I noticed a big difference. I mean, I remember driving with my mom from my hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee to Nashville and seeing like stuff on, billboards advertising like pink AR-15s and just going, why would anyone ever want that? I just didn't understand. It did not compute to me. And again, I recognize that people do hunt with, modern sporting rifles. I understand that people also hunt with like handguns, but those are pretty exceptional, right? Like that's not the norm.
Sure.
Most people hunt with, designs that would have seemed very familiar in, 1870, much less.
Yeah. I mean, I think just at the end, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on this because when I get back to the hunting part, because I actually do have some more questions on that. But, I think people hear these attitudes, and I'm sure you've heard, people have a derogatory name for this, right? Fuds, Elmer Fudd, people. And the idea is meant to be that like, you there's guns that you like, and you're okay if the guns that you don't like get banned, right? That as long as you have your guns, that's how people look at this.
Yeah,
right?
and
that's how critics will.
Yeah, and there's also, I think a bit,
and that it's a lot of aesthetic stuff. Like, why would you want a pink gun? Well, I mean, some people just enjoy that aesthetically. And nobody has to buy a pink gun.
And I can see there's also like some snobbery, right? Like when in kind of upland hunting, there's some people that wouldn't be seen without, not just a break action shotgun, but like a double gun, right? Like a side by side. Otherwise, you're kind of gauche.
Right.
If you're hunting birds with a semi-automatic. So I know that there's some snobbery there as well. I think it's just a reality that like, if you're like me, if you're just the average American, when you see an AR-15 in the news, it's probably not for anything good. It's probably because somebody's done something horrible, like horrific with it. And,
but there's 24 million of them out there and only a tiny fraction are you. Yeah. You understand.
I don't think you're helping yourself. I think a lot of Americans are going to ask, why are there 24 million out there? And I don't ask it with like, why should they be, we should ban them or we should confiscate them. I'm genuinely curious. Like, I understand, like, the thing where I probably differ from a lot of your listeners, Stephen, is that I just don't have like the paranoia of I got friends that have AR-15s. So I'm like, why do you own those things, man? And they're like, well, I'm worried about, the federal government overreach. And, we're recording today on September 7th, and like Liberty safes. I've got like 2 Liberty safes that's trending on Twitter right now, because I guess they allowed like the FBI to access some January 6th suspects, safe or something like that. And like people are up in arms. Like people are really, like literally up in arms, really angry at Liberty safe. That's where I just don't understand. Like, I'm not down with kind of that paranoia and that kind of suspicion of the federal government. Maybe that's actually because I'm from the South, and because when we've seen kind of like government tyranny in American history in the South, it's usually from state and local governments, not from kind of the federal government. But I just don't identify with it. And I think the people that do have kind of that real suspicion of the federal government, I think they're much more likely to think that they need an AR-15. I just don't see it. And so I just think it's weird.
Yeah. And then look, I'm sure there are plenty of people who think that's odd. I mean, you can see it in polling, right? And certainly there are lots of Americans who support banning them. I mean, I know you said you don't, but obviously beyond this sort of political philosophy of owning firearms as a deterrent to tyranny, which is a legitimate and real reason why a lot of people own firearms, there are obviously a lot of practical reasons to own an AR-15. from just the modular design of it, you can make it into whatever sort of gun you would want to use it for: competition shooting, sport shooting. Home defense is another good reason to have an AR. They're very capable rifles, as you know, and that's where I think
to do what
there's
Steven?
no
here. Let me pose it this way. So some of the earliest firearms games, like Skeet, for example. Take Skeet as an example. Why does Skeet exist? Skeet exists because grouse hunters in New England were like, what do we do when it's not grouse season? If you've ever hunted grouse, it's hard. You walk forever, and then they pop up real quick, and you rarely get a shot that is clean. You're usually firing through brush. So how can you improve your reaction times? Well, so Skeet was born as a means for grouse hunters to practice that.
Sure.
What are people practicing when they're practicing 3-gun?
I mean, do they need to be practicing for a practical outcome? I mean, certainly there's sport shooting that exists to prepare you for real world events, but it doesn't have to be that way. But when you play football, are you preparing for some sort of life event where you're going to run through a dozen people?
Yeah, but at the same time, we think the drift towards tactical weaponry. I do think it leads towards kind of fantasies of kind of conflict, right? In ways that I just think we have to be, we have to be honest about kind of the connection of certain types of weapons to. I mean, there's a difference between a Benelli Ultralight and a Benelli M4, right?
The other thing that
one
also
is designed for upland hunting, one is designed for something else. Yeah,
room breaching or stuff. Sure, I understand. But another significant thing that happened to lead to the rise of popularity of AR-15s was the Global War on Terror, which you participated in. There a lot of people became trained on these guns. Same reason that the 1911 became so popular. It's both civilian admiration for the military that leads to that, but also veterans like these firearms. They use them when they were in the service, and they want them when they're not. Right. And so, I don't think it needs to be a nefarious thing. I understand there's legitimate criticism.
Look, man, I got plenty of friends that served, and they're like, why do you own those? And it's like, well, that's because the weapon I was trained on.
I think that's a minor.
I get it. I get it. I'm not, like I said, I'm not one that's thinks that the government should knock down people's doors and take these things away. I just would ask people, ask themselves, why do you really need it? If it's for home defense, why not Remington 870? Why not, Beretta A300?
You could say this, but you could make that argument all the way down to a single shot break action. That's what I mean. Where people draw the line is going to be very different depending on what they determine they need. Just because you own an AR-15 doesn't mean you're planning to overthrow the government or carry out a mass shooting. Obviously, I'm sure we both agree on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say that I read about AR-15s in the news all the time, and it's never for anything good. Never for anything good.
Yeah, I mean, I read about 9mm handguns in the news, or maybe I should read about it even more because those are much more common in crime. But I don't think that everybody who owns a 9mm handgun is a potential, gang murderer, right?
No, but there's ambivalence about that as well. I mean, look, you are right. Where do you draw the line? Because we do draw the line, right? There are certain types of weapons that you can't own without a certain, without even, kind of licenses beyond. I mean, can't own my own personal M240 Bravo. I can't own crew served weapons, right?
Sure.
Maybe there might be some way you could own them, but you probably have to.
I mean, you can. You got
to get an FFL and some
you got to be an NF. They have to be registered in the NFA.
Right. Exactly. So we've established that there is a case where we understand there has to be some sort of registration, right? And again, it goes down to where you draw that line. I mean, my mother-in-law doesn't think we should own any weapons, right?
There are lots of people who think you should be able to own machine guns. I would not say it's a majority position, but there are plenty of people, especially in the gun rights community, that do believe that. So yeah, I mean, there's certainly lines all over the place, and we don't have to. Nobody has to agree, and there's hundreds of millions of gunners in the country. Or at least somewhere near 100 million, depending on the numbers you look at, the estimates that you have. And not everyone is going to agree, right? And that's one of the things about the podcast.
I think what I try to do, Stephen, when I'm thinking about this as a father, I am trying to introduce my own children to firearms in a healthy way, right? So the first thing I'm introducing them to is the Winchester Model 47 single shot 22 that I was first introduced to, right?
Sure.
Like, almost 4 decades ago. I'm trying to introduce them to hunting and to using, firearms as a means of take, right? In the same way that I'm introducing my children to archery. That's my decision as kind of as a father. And I understand, that other people have a different approach, but I am thinking about what do I think a healthy relationship with firearms is, both as a family and as an individual. What type of relationship do I want my own children to have with firearms? And that's kind of behind my own decision making. I understand that people are in different places, and that some people, don't feel comfortable with firearms at all. Those people, I'd love to have a conversation with those folks and, show them how the way in which in my family we use firearms, as part of hunting and as part of the things that we do. I also understand that, some folks use firearms in ways that make me uncomfortable, right? Because it just looks a lot like, what I used to do when my job was, a little bit more grim.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a conversation everybody has to have with themselves, right? What their comfort level is with firearms and how they want to, introduce them to their family and to bring it back to hunting, because we did get sidetracked for longer than I meant to, but that idea you have there of teaching your kids about firearms responsibility, the responsible use of firearms through hunting, and sort of this ethos, a hunter's ethos, I guess you might call it, of sustainability, of using your own 2 feet to go out and harvest the game that you're going to eat for yourself, because there is this danger, I think, and I believe you talk about this in your Atlantic piece, of thinking that your food comes from the grocery store. I mean, that's
the famous Aldo Leopold quote, right? Which is that this is the great danger of not hunting, not fishing, that not farming, which is that you lose track of kind of where the stuff comes from. I also think there's something else that I think, to bring it to a place where I would hope that everybody listening to this podcast has shares as common ground. Responsible use of firearms and responsible handling of firearms, and just teaching my kids very early on, what do you do when you come across a firearm, right? What do you do? Do you touch it? Do you go tell an adult? How do you treat a firearm? Treating every firearm as if it's loaded, never pointing at anything that you're not willing to destroy. Those are important rules, I think, that we need to start teaching kids earlier and earlier. And that's why, as we talked about, hunter safety, I would love kind of almost all, schools to have some sort of rudimentary, just kind of firearms safety, hunter safety, just something, because I do think that, whether or not you're somebody who's listening to this podcast and thinks that, our firearms laws are way too restrictive, or whether you're somebody listening to this podcast and thinks that it is insane that we're able to have the firearms that we do have in this country, regardless of that, in a post-Heller world, like, firearms are just a reality. They're something that our kids are going to be growing up with. And again, what I try to do is try to, teach my kids a healthy appreciation of firearms and turn it into something positive that folks can, that we can use for good, to put food on the table for the family.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, just to close things off here, me and my girlfriend have just signed up for a hunter safety course for the first time here in Virginia at Fort Belvoir. They've got a free course that we're going to, and because she was interested in getting into hunting. She's from the Philippines originally, but she's an American citizen now, and obviously I've been into firearms for a long time, but I've never hunted before. I've never, I guess I've always been a little bit squeamish about it, to be honest.
Really?
Not really interested in killing anything. Even
oh wow,
squirrels and stuff. But as I've gotten older, I think
Let me
I've
ask
gotten
you,
a little
like,
bit more
no, now I'm
mature
curious.
on
Now
that.
I got to interview you. Like, how do you get
Yeah.
interested in just firearms overall? Do you just, just kind of enjoy them? Do you enjoy kind of handgun marksmanship, or what do you enjoy?
Yeah, no, I got into it later in life. After college,
Uh-huh.
it was one of my first jobs. There was a fun day, and one of the options was it was just at the boss's like cabin and out in the Virginia woods.
Yeah.
And one of the things they had to do was skeet shooting with a like a Remington 870 and a hand thrown
Which is not
clay,
easy
but
if you're shooting doubles, by the way. If
no,
it's
it was hand
hand-thrown
thrown
singles,
clay
that's okay.
too.
Yeah.
So yeah, but still not like your ideal setup, not what you would get if you went to an actual skeet shooting range. But I'd always been afraid of firearms in the sense that I was afraid of recoil.
Really?
Never been afraid of getting shot or anything like that. But,
I hope not.
Well, I grew up in like a small town, but there were other people around hunted, but our family never was involved with firearms much. So I just didn't have that exposure and was afraid of recoil mainly when I first started. And so then I shot that shotgun and I hit the clay.
Yeah.
And so it was like, oh, first of all, it didn't hurt.
Yeah.
Although I wouldn't recommend starting a novice on a 12 gauge shotgun, but that is how I got it. And it was a lot of fun. And so from there, I just kind of became more and more interested in it personally. And, with firearms, it's like shoes, right? I have, how many do you need? Well, or how many you want more than or how many you have? I'm sorry. There's a whole saying that I'm screwing up, right? How many do you have? More than I need, but not as many as I want.
Yes.
And you can, like shoes, you can get by with one gun or one pair of shoes, but you might want a different gun for all sorts of different things, just like you might want different shoes for different sorts of events or outings or whatever. And so, it's snowballed from there, but I still was never interested.
My wife is very familiar
hunting
with this conversation because I have,
Right.
I have way too many shotguns for various needs. Yeah.
And then I was also, my dad's a contractor. So I grew up working with my hands in that way, but obviously I'm a writer, so I don't do that professionally. And so I'm into building computers. I'm into working on my car, and guns are a natural fit. I know people probably might not think that initially, but it's very similar. Building a computer and building a gun, you're building from parts. You're customizing in the way that you want it. I built the AR that's behind me on the wall here, and another sort of aspect of why people like the gun. But there's the mechanics of how a gun operates is another thing that interests me, as well as learning to shoot well is difficult, right? Skill to master. Fairly easy to get the basics of shooting down.
Yes.
But mastering, precision is hard.
I feel that way. I mean, I'm I feel reasonably confident that when I hold a pistol or a rifle, because the basic principles of marksmanship are pretty simple.
Right.
And you can just repeat those, it's just kind of, breathing, trigger squeeze, they don't change.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I love shooting shotguns is that I'm not naturally good at it. I wasn't naturally good at it. It's just different. Like you're not aiming, you're pointing. It's a much more athletic, endeavor. And I really enjoy it. So look, my promise to you is that when you get your hunting license, like, let's go hunt together. Let's wait for woodcock season in like Virginia and Maryland. Great. Let's get out there. You'll see the dogs at work. You'll see a different, you may only shoot once the entire day or not at all. Right. But it's fun. And I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah. And that's another thing. Like I'm hoping to get resources on how to actually get involved in hunting and without knowing people going in. Cause obviously there's a lot of like, you grow up into hunting in a lot of cases. Yeah. And so if you don't have that background, if you don't have somebody who can show you, it's harder to do. But so that that'd be wonderful if we could do that. Well,
I have no idea where you are, but like I'm probably the only person in my alley in my neighborhood that like
I'm in Alexandria.
Okay, so I butchered a deer in my garage last year, the day after Christmas. I'm probably the only person.
I don't think my apartment would let me do that.
Yeah, but the next time I do that, you should come over and watch that, because like the process of taking something that you shot, like as soon as you shoot it and recover the animal, at that point, like the process by which it becomes something that you shot and becomes from an animal to then becoming meat on the table, that's a whole nother process.
Yeah.
And that's something that like I also really enjoy and get my kids involved in, because that I think is an important part of hunting as well. And a lot of people just like kind of take their deer to a processor. I don't. I like to, butcher it and process it all myself. And which I, much to my wife's chagrin, which I do in like the garage in our in our basement. But I think that's also a really important thing. So when you get your hunting license, like, count on me.
Yeah.
I'll teach you to, and I'm sure a lot of people will also do this. I mean, there's within kind of the hunting community, they place a real emphasis on getting new people out into the field, introducing them to hunting. To the degree that I can do that for you, let me know. And your girlfriend.
Yeah. And for me, a big part of it is just, I eat meat all the time.
Yeah.
And so this idea that I am too uncomfortable to hunt, even though I'm perfectly happy to eat the food, doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Well, I mean,
right?
yeah,
So,
I agree. I mean, this is one of the reasons why my wife and I kind of were looking around and we're like, if we're just going to keep eating meat, which we're going to, because meat's delicious, like we should do this in a sustainable way. And so, so we've tried to do that. I don't think my kids ate ground beef until like June this year. It was all ground venison. So mixed in with a little pork fat.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll have to connect outside of the podcast, and I'll have to give people an update once we do this.
I know you need to do it. Hey man, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks for, I appreciated the back and forth. I think, I'm probably in a very different place than a lot of your listeners on gun culture, but I'm also in an extremely different place than most people on the political left regarding gun culture. So, so it's a lonely place that I occupy in the.
Well, but I think it's interesting, and I think it's worth discussion. Your whole background and your worldview is definitely fascinating, and that's the kind of people we like to have on here. So I appreciate you being willing to come on and to get into some of that stuff.
Well, thanks, man.
The main topic was the hunting aspect. So I appreciate you being able to do both and giving people, the audience, a good understanding where you're coming from on this.
And thanks to the audience for their patience as well. I'm sure hopefully they were equally offended by both of us.
And so where can people find more of your writing if they want to follow up?
Yeah, these days, again, I've got 4 kids and I've got a full-time job. So I write for the Atlantic irregularly, but when I write, I tend to write for the Atlantic. And, I write book reviews and things as well, but the Atlantic's probably a pretty good place to find me.
All right, wonderful. Well, we're going to head over to our news update now, so appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, as always, by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve? I'm
doing great. Football just started last night. The Lions beat the Chiefs, which was interesting to watch. I did pick the Lions to cover, so I was pretty happy about that.
Yeah.
The Chiefs were 4.5 point favorites, so it wasn't, you're never sure in that. So I think it should have been a larger line, but hey, the Lions picked it off anyway. So pretty happy about that, although not very happy with Sky Moore, who I started in one of my fantasy leagues and I think he got 0.4 points.
Yeah, that's a little rough.
That was cool. Yeah, I mean, like you would think on the Chiefs offense, this high power offense where they pass a lot, with Travis Kelce out, that Sky Moore or Tony, the other guy that they have, who like nobody's, how are these guys going to shape out? You'd think one of them, somebody on the Chiefs offense is going to benefit at some point, right, in fantasy. But apparently not, because they both were terrible. And,
yeah, that's rough.
I didn't start Tony, at least, just Moore, because I figured, well, all right, he's more likely to do something, and he did nothing. So great, that was great. What about you? Did you have anyone playing last night?
Yeah, so I have David Montgomery on my team, and he had a pretty good game. He got in the end zone, so I'm pretty excited. Off to a good start for the fantasy season, and like you said, I'm just excited football's back. It's been far too long since we've had some football on.
Yeah, me too. Although I think Cooper Kupp is on. I drafted Cooper Kupp in one of my leagues.
Oh yeah.
And I still don't know if we have an answer as to what's going on with him, if he's going to go on IR or what. But so not a great start for me. not super happy, but I am very happy that football is back, and I'm looking forward to the Eagles playing on Sunday, and to just sitting around watching Red Zone all day outside of when the Eagles are specifically playing. Yeah. And also now, Red Zone, or not Red Zone, but Sunday Ticket, it's easy to get now because you don't have to buy DirecTV along with it. So that's nice. Although this is the first time I could realistically buy it, is also the first year where the Eagles, I don't know that they're ever not going to be on nationally, because they're playing like primetime games like half the season. And then a lot of the other games they're playing are late day games, so they're not necessarily playing at the same time as the Commanders or whatever they call themselves now here in DC. So you don't necessarily have that conflict where the local stations are going to pick one over the other, because they're going to pick the Commanders every time. But so I don't know if I'm ever going to need Sunday Ticket, which is good for the bank account, I guess.
I was gonna say, saves money.
Yeah. But I also went to as people could probably tell from the shirt, anyone watching on YouTube, the Postal Service Death Cab for Cutie concert in DC. It was apparently I didn't realize this until we were there. It was the opening show of that tour. This is the 20th anniversary tour for their first two albums, Transatlanticism and Give Up, and it was amazing. And it was at the Anthem, which is a very nice, newer venue in DC down at the Wharf. The Wharf was everything there is wildly overpriced. It's very nice, like new developed area of DC. But oh my God, we went to a restaurant that was insanely overpriced, and the food was not good. And then we bought some. It was like 100 degrees. First of all, it's been super hot in DC this week, but I bought some mochi wrapped ice cream, and we got 4 of them, 4 little, ice cream balls for $14. And they also were not good. Yeah. Like I was like, man, I'm never coming back to the Wharf again.
That's sort of the sign of the times. Everything's overpriced and it's not that great.
Everything was wildly overpriced. And it's funny because it all costs more than like the tickets were the only thing that weren't overpriced. I paid $50 to park there, which is nuts. Yeah. In the parking garage. I mean, man, it was a terrible experience outside of the actual concert, which was amazing. Thank God. And wasn't even like next time I'm going to anything at the Anthem, I'm just not going to do anything else there. And I'm going to find somewhere else to park and walk over there because everything else about the experience on the Wharf was not enjoyable. It's nice, like it's new, but man, and I don't know, maybe it's just because of the restaurant that we ended up at. But wow, yeah, not a good time. Before the concert, the concert was amazing. It's funny because the 20-year anniversary of these 2 albums, and they played the entire albums all the way through, which was great. And then they did a couple encores. But I mean, I'm getting a little old for concerts, right? Like it started at 7:30 or whatever, and of course there's an opening act, right? There's always an opening act. I didn't see anywhere on any of the materials that said there was going to be an opening act, but there was, which is fine. It was good, but also not why I went there to see, right, on a weeknight as a 36-year-old guy, and then stand around for half an hour between when the opening act finished and the band actually came, the Death Cab came out. I just, oh my gosh, I didn't, and it's standing room only. And man, it's just the albums, ironically enough, talk a lot about going gray and getting old. And from 20 years ago when I was not doing either of those things. And now I am. And I don't know that I can stand for concerts for that long anymore. But of course the seats at the Anthem are like 3 times more expensive than standing room. So
right.
I don't know. It was worth it in the end. But yeah, my bank account didn't enjoy the whole experience.
Yeah. Well, at least the show is good. That's what counts.
And I got this nice $40 t-shirt.
Yeah, I was going to say the concert merch.
Yeah. What about you? You got do anything fun or have anything coming up?
Yeah, so I'm just excited for this weekend. It's a big football weekend here in Colorado. Obviously, the Broncos open up on Sunday. Everyone's excited to see what Sean Payton's going to do with the team. And then Saturday, the Colorado Buffaloes play Nebraska, old classic college football rivalry, and the Buffs are finally looking like they're good again with Coach Prime. So it's just going to be a huge football weekend. I'm excited.
That's right. Yeah, I forgot that's where that whole. I'm not big into college football. I mean, I went to a small Christian school, so we didn't even have a football team. But yeah, the whole Coach Prime thing is pretty fascinating, and they won, right? They won their first game.
They beat TCU, who was the runner-up in the national championship last year. So that's a big win,
right? So that's pretty fascinating to see. I know that's not normal in Colorado, right?
Yeah, we haven't been good for a while. We used to be a great powerhouse football school, but not for a couple decades at least. So,
well, that's exciting then. I love football. I'm definitely going to sit on Sunday and just watch. Was it 8 hours of 8 hours of uninterrupted football? That's the red zone.
That's
thing.
The pitch. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm going to do for sure. and more than that, really, because that ends before Sunday night football. I'm going to continue to do that. Thank God for football. But anyway, back. Let's get to the news that people came here for. What do we got going on?
Sure. So we'll head over to the headlines in the newsletter. So first, we got a story from the Wall Street Journal about a bill, Assembly Bill 28, that just cleared the California State Senate, which would add an 11% excise tax on all firearm and ammunition sales in California. And this would be in addition to the federal excise tax that funds conservation efforts. And I believe California already has like a $37 fee as well that they levy on gun and ammunition sales. So this is going to be a pretty hefty tax hike for folks looking to buy, ammunition and firearms going forward, if this is going to pass. And it's looking like all indications suggest that it's going to pass both chambers and go to Newsom's desk.
Yeah. This is sort of a gimmick that you see occasionally from Democrats. There was a House bill along these lines, although this one is at least somewhere in the realm of not completely laughable, I guess. I mean, it's obviously pretty high, but I think the House bill in Congress was like, 150. It wasn't like 1,000% tax or something.
Yeah,
insane.
I believe so.
On so-called assault weapons, right? It's basically like a way of banning them, but using taxes instead. Sort of the old school method, the National Firearms Act method. Right. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's a more interesting tactic, right? Because the government has a taxing authority, right? And it's not as highly questioned as other attempts to like outright ban products or something. But obviously at some point that runs up against the Second Amendment right. And it'll be really interesting to see how that all plays out. If this bill does get into law in this form, like you said, it probably will. And I'm very sure that it'll be challenged. And I don't know, where's that? There's obviously a conflict there between the Second Amendment right and the taxing authority of the government. And, because there's got to be a tipping point somewhere. It's just where the courts are going to draw it, I think, is going to be the ultimate question. I mean, in the post-Bruin era, presumably they'll have to find some historical analog for taxing guns and ammunition at that high a level. But I don't know. I mean, they might just have to find that they've been taxed. It's definitely a more difficult, I think, provision for gun rights advocates to go after than just a regular ban or something of that nature.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it'll be interesting to see once it does pass what happens with it in the courts. But speaking of the courts, our other link, we have a story out of Reuters. We have a federal ruling from a judge in New York that issued an injunction against the company Rare Breed Triggers, that's known for selling what are called forced reset triggers, which, as sort of the name implies, after you pull the trigger, it forces your finger forward, it forces the trigger to reset. So in theory, you can fire the weapon faster. And the government argued that this was essentially a machine gun. And the judge in this case decided that they were likely to succeed in the merits of that and ordered the company to stop selling these. So that's, a pretty big ruling.
Yeah, certainly. And this is going to be another fight similar to the bump stock ban between the ATF and gun rights advocates. And I doubt it's over after that. Certainly, I think you'll see more of these lawsuits and further appeals on this matter. So it's another one to keep an eye on, right? Another one that's implicated in all of these recent ATF decisions and their attempts to restrict certain kinds of firearm accessories and parts.
Right. And then the final link we'll talk about is sort of a follow-up to a story we actually covered a few months back. So Texas just passed a bill in their last legislative session to require that schools have at least one armed personnel at every school in the state, every public school in the state, whether it's a police officer, private security, or armed staff. Schools get some discretion. And so we have a story from the Associated Press that apparently many schools are having some trouble fulfilling that requirement, and a lot of them are blaming the funding. So there was funding included in the bill, but some of them are saying it's insufficient for the task of ensuring that there's armed staff. So it's sort of interesting that there's a logistical hurdle.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road on these kind of policies, right? And it's the kind of thing that I think gets a lot of support, especially if it's some sort of officially trained security officer or police officer. But there's real world issues in terms of finding the money to do this sort of thing. It's hard to fund schools generally, right? In a lot of places. So adding a security officer on top of that, while there might be a great deal of agreement that it should happen in the wake of things like Uvalde, it's in practice, it gets harder to implement than it does in theory. Everything's pretty easy to implement in theory.
Right. And then on to some of the stories we covered this week. This kind of relates a little bit to the main interview, but we had that letter that a group of bipartisan lawmakers sent to the Department of Education, trying to clarify perhaps what they thought their intent was in passing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and urging funding to be reinstated for school hunting programs and other related programs that involve weapons. So it's sort of interesting to see a bipartisan group of senators come back together after being the bipartisan group that passed this bill in the first place.
Yeah, it's really the first significant bipartisan push on gun policy since the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. There have been a number of other gun policy pushes. There's even been, we talked about recently, the pushback against another aspect of the bill and how it's been enforced with the president's plan to expand who needs a gun dealing license based on a language change in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. But this is the first one that's captured a lot of senators from either side of the aisle, and in particular, really powerful senators and senators from significant states, like swing states, I should say. Pennsylvania, both of their Democratic senators. You've got both senators from West Virginia, both senators from Arizona. You had 21 in total. You had, John Cornyn and Chris Murphy are on one of these letters. And they were the ones who led the negotiations on the bill in the first place. So this just gives you an insight into where Washington is, what, at least in the Senate, they agree on as far as gun policy. And that's, we should continue to fund these hunter safety programs, archery programs. Now, to be fair to the Department of Education here, the language sure does suggest that they can't use those federal funds for any sort of training involving any dangerous weapon. And that could actually, because of the definition of dangerous weapon being very broad, that could even include like kitchen knives, which they talk about in the letter. So kind of seems like a drafting error on their part. They didn't intend to do this, but the language sure suggests it's how it's being done the way it's supposed to. And so that one of the things they asked, besides telling DOE to change how they're looking at this language, is that they asked the Appropriations Committee to add in some new language to fix the problem. And I think that's probably what's going to end up actually happening. Right.
Well, like you said, it certainly sounds like a drafting error, but it does lend credence to what we heard from some of the Republican senators that you reached out to previously about this, that they truly didn't expect that this was going to be the eventual outcome from that provision. But certainly, as you pointed out, it's kind of hard to imagine.
I think it was meant to prevent the use of those federal funds for training teachers to carry guns, basically. that's what they were trying to prevent or trying to like clarify, but instead the language was so broad that they ended up going much further than that. And we got time for one more story. What's the last one?
Yeah, so we actually have a new lawsuit against the city of Boston. We've covered Boston being sued by gun rights groups in the past, and they're back again because they're alleging that the city's police department, their licensing unit in particular, is sort of slow walking its processing of applications for carry permits. This is, a pretty common thing we've seen in a lot of big cities lately, and certainly Boston's no exception. A few of the plaintiffs in this case, at least two of them at least, have alleged that they've been waiting for longer than 6 months to even hear back about when they can do their fingerprinting and complete the process, when Massachusetts state law gives these licensing authorities 40 days to process an application and arrive at a decision. So clearly there is some delay, whether or not it's intentional. That's sort of what's being alleged in the lawsuit, but that'll be for the courts to flesh out.
Yeah, but I think we can all make an educated guess on that point, right?
Right.
Especially since they did this before, right? This is not the first time they've been sued over this exact practice of slow walking applications. You've seen this in other places. Philadelphia is a common example where they tried tricks like this. And oftentimes many places have that sort of some sort of time limit that the state puts on how long it takes, but oftentimes there's no sort of teeth to that.
Right.
And so localities will just kind of ignore it, and they'll come up with, workarounds. We got 40 days to process. Well, all right, we'll just make you wait to actually submit the application. Philly did that for a while.
Right.
DC does that. And so, but in the end, they've had very little success, these cities, in standing up to lawsuits like this. And in fact, Boston has had to pay out legal fees in the past over this exact issue. And so I don't see any reason why it wouldn't end up the same way. And at some point, it feels like it's just a roundabout way of donating to gun rights groups because they end up having to pay them regardless. So I guess maybe it plays politically for the elected officials in Boston, but it just seems a bit odd when you zoom out a little bit and look at the whole situation. Right.
Yeah. No, it sort of goes to this ongoing trend of formerly May issue states that were sort of had their carry paradigms overturned by Bruin, that are finding new ways to perhaps resist the new paradigm that we find ourselves in. As you pointed out, Boston previously refused to accept applications. They shut down their licensing unit during COVID and then kept it shut down for, what the courts found was unreasonably long time. And so they had to pay gun rights groups. And now they're accepting applications, but they're not processing them. So it's just going to be, like you said, just like Philadelphia, it's probably going to end up with a settlement or an order. And gun rights groups are probably going to collect some legal fees when it's all said and done.
Probably. But we'll stay on top of that one as well as the rest of these stories. So make sure you come back every week to listen to the show, right? Or check over at thereload.com. Or sign up for our free newsletter, which goes out every Friday, gives you the latest in one simple email with what's going on with guns in America. And of course, if you want to go deeper than that, if you want to get a better understanding of these stories, you can buy a membership and help fund our reporting, but also get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis that you will not find anywhere else in the world, on the internet or otherwise. And of course, that's what helps us keep the lights on, helps us stay independent as a publication. And we really appreciate the support of our members and everyone else who's doing their part to help us stay in business and keep churning out stories for you. Of course, members also get this podcast a day earlier and the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment. We have to do another one of those soon, hopefully. We'll get some members to volunteer for that. But that's all we've got for this week, and we will see you guys again real soon.